Okay, welcome one and all. This is our first panel after the opening speech by the President. The title for this is Refugees, Populism, Brexit, Is the EU Coming Apart? We have four individuals to discuss these issues. At the far end is Pat Cox, who's the former president of the European Parliament. Next to him, we have Wolfgang Ischinger, who chairs the Munich Security Conference, and among other things, was the German ambassador to the United States of America. Next to him, we have José Manuel Barroso, who was until recently president of the European Commission and was also prime minister of his country, Portugal. And last but not least, we have Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is one of those people who thinks and writes and does it with élan and insight. So it is a pleasure to be up here with the four of them. The way it's going to work, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Richard Haass from New York, from the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm going to ask some questions of these four individuals. Then I'm going to turn to Karl Rove, who's one of the leading analysts of American politics and is also a practitioner as well, to make a few comments from the American perspective. And then we will open up the conversation as well to you all. And the idea is to finish in about 40 minutes from now. So let me start with the bottom line, which is when one looks at Europe, one has Brexit, one has the rise of populist and nationalist parties, one has low economic growth, one has fiscal problems, problems in coordinating a monetary policy with at the collective level with national fiscal policies. The German chancellor just had a political setback the other weekend. The polls in France, shall we say, show the president there at fairly low popularity. So essentially, how pessimistic should we be about the present and future of Europe? And another way of putting it is, how structural are these problems? Is this something that is simply likely to pass? Or is Europe now facing, in many ways, the greatest challenge of the post-World War II order, in some ways since the beginning of the modern European project? So Pat, why don't we just start with you, and we'll go through this.
Okay, good morning. It's very good to be here, and thank you for your question. We can look each way, and I want to deal with your question, but, build that wall, Mexico will pay, anti-immigration, rise in nativism. This is something to do with phenomena that doesn't stop at the Atlantic. It's happening in different places, in slightly different ways, and it's the same kind of phenomenon. I think for the European Union, the Russian revanchism and what has happened in Ukraine is a huge challenge. The President has spoken about it today. The management of borders and the immigration question reached a peak perhaps some months ago. It hasn't gone away. It has calmed versus what was there before. I think its biggest question now is more about integration than the border management part, but the biggest sensitivity is still about the border management part. There's a time lag. I think on the economy side, there are still some real structural issues to do with the journey to reform the Eurozone. I think if it was a football match, that the Eurozone crisis is at half-time, but there's still some part of that game to go. I would be happy to develop that, but I just make that point. And then Brexit brings us into an uncharted terrain. This is the first time in the post-Second World War process of European integration that a member state has decided to step down. And we don't know the details. We don't know will it be a hard or soft divorce. The British don't know which kind of divorce they want before the rest can deal with it. But what we do know about it is that some of the issues which are very British in terms of attitude are not exclusively and only British. And that again raises some question, as you do, about the future. The one thing I would say, and I will close on this in this first remark, we have these images today of the seas of change. And right now, those seas of change are carrying us towards a lot of angst, anxiety, self-reflection, and preoccupation, necessarily so. If we want to be realists, you cannot change things by refusing to address reality. But as Shakespeare said, there is a tide in the affairs of men, and I think we're at a high tide of a period of people being unsettled with the post-war settlements on both sides of the Atlantic. But each high tide is followed by a new tide. And the one thing I would say is that we should not cave in to pessimism because realistically we have so many challenges. I think if we allow pessimism to reign, the hypothesis that things could fall apart could indeed be so. The challenge is for a rational centre to find the determination and the courage to hold and build the best of what we have, and to understand, perhaps for the European Union, that the hypothesis of the ever closer union perhaps might borrow a phrase from the Declaration of Rights of the USA, to work for a more perfect union, to address our imperfections as our urgent issue, more than to seek more deepening of the institutional and constitutional space.
I want to return to that theme. Wolfgang, I'd like you to address the same thing, but also through the prism of your own country. One of the strengths of Europe has for some time now been the strength of Germany, and above all, the position of the German Chancellor. And the question is whether we're seeing the beginning of the end of the Merkel era. And one, do you think so? And if so, what is your sense then of the implications of that for Germany, its relations with Europe, and for Europe more broadly?
All right, thank you very much, Richard. Let me begin by making what I think is the fundamental point that needs to be made. As a German, I happen not only to be extremely proud of the European Union and what has been built over half a century now, from the original 6 to the now 28, with a number of countries actually waiting to enter. You're right, one member country has now decided to leave, but we see how hard it is to actually start this process of divorce. So I am proud, and I believe that it is a total exaggeration to have this discussion about the EU falling apart. Our nation states, beginning with the Ukraine, our host country, including my country, including the United States, we all have serious problems at the moment. But we don't seem to find it necessary to discuss, is Poland falling apart, is Germany falling apart, but we find it attractive to say, is the EU falling apart? The EU is actually not falling apart because it is indispensable, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, obviously, just like our nation states, the European Union is an incomplete and to some extent inefficient instrument. It needs constant improvement. One of the things that I find unfortunate, Richard, is that the European Union has not been able to develop the self-confidence and the willingness to act as a player in the world. The refugees which left the Middle East did not show up on Red Square in Moscow. They also didn't go to Pennsylvania Avenue. They came all to Europe. But we didn't seem to be able to manage the courage and get our act together in order to call the world and to call all the players together about a year ago when things began to get really worse. We had to wait, and I'm sorry to say, I applaud John Kerry's and Sergei Lavrov's attempts, but I think we, the European Union, should have actually taken the initiative first and started the process. So there are deficiencies. There are also deficiencies in terms of some of our constructions. I'm going to be brief, but let me just...
But Wolfgang, let me just ask the question, because we've got a lot to cover. Even if Europe's not falling apart, given exactly what you said, is it fair to conclude it's reached its high watermark, and the future of Europe is certainly a less integrated, it's in that sense, it's much more different countries find their own relationship with Europe?
I don't think so, Richard. I think that there are, of course, issues which nation states can and probably should handle themselves. The curriculum in your school and many other issues can be handled at the nation state level. But we seem to forget, we in the European Union, we seem to forget the sentence which a Belgian politician, Paul-Henri Spaak, said many years ago. He said there are two kinds of countries in the European Union: small countries and countries that have not yet understood that they are small. And the larger strategic issues that we are facing, whether it's climate, whether it's our external security, whether it's fighting terrorism, etc., it's a long list, cannot be managed on the basis of the nation state. I'm afraid to tell you, I think our British friends and neighbors will find that out the hard way once they have really executed the divorce. So I think there is a need for not just generally more EU, but a better and more resilient European Union that focuses on the questions that are of a strategic nature that the nation state cannot effectively handle itself.
Okay, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm a little bit surprised at Wolfgang's answer, so let me ask you a similar question with a slightly, let my bias show even more. That the future of Europe is not one size fits all, but instead that, I don't know what the expression is this week, some kind of a multi-speed Europe with several different kinds of bargains or compacts between governments and Brussels. And isn't that a much more realistic vision of the future than one of a highly integrated, one-size-fits-all Europe?
Thank you, Richard. Yes, I think we have already, to some extent, this, what we call variable geometry in Europe. We have countries in the euro, countries not in the euro, countries in Schengen, countries not in Schengen. But the real issue for me, and now I'm speaking with experience of having led the European Commission for 10 years, is the sense of ownership of the governments of Europe on the European project. In this equation of power, the real missing variable is leadership. Brexit is a case in point. It was a very bad case of leadership. When, of course, the leadership of a country like Britain, mostly the Conservative Party, was bashing Europe for 30 years, cannot expect to have the people to support them when they are making the campaign for Europe in 3 weeks. And that is the issue, that I think it's important that the leaders of the European Union at national level to understand, namely the so-called mainstream parties from the center-left to the center-right, that they have to address those challenges that we have today, basically the economic social one on one side, with huge problem of unemployment, and the issue of migration, illegal migration, that is really of a complete different nature because it touches very, let's say, sensitive matters in Europe. Those parties have to regain the initiative. Today, the initiative in Europe is taken by the populists, far-right, Eurosceptic, nationalistic, xenophobic. Sometimes also there is a left-wing populism. And the reality is that the two most important political families in Europe, the Socialists and Social Democrats and the EPP, the center-right politicians, have lost the initiative. I think the left, moderate left, was not able to combine macroeconomic rigor with growth. They have not a solution for that issue. The center-right has not the solution for the issue of identity that is compatible with our values. And so we are in a defensive. And some of our countries, I would say, France is the key issue, because France is still the critical country in Europe. Today everybody speaks about Germany, and I really believe that Angela Merkel is above all the others in terms of political stature, but the reality is that France is the most central country in Europe. Now there are meetings of the North countries, of the South countries. There is one country that is North and South in Europe, and that country is France. But France does not believe in itself. And that negativism of France projects also its shadow over the European institutions. I've been fighting what I've called the intellectual glamour of pessimism. Today in Europe, if you want to show that you are intelligent, you say that the worst is always going to happen. But in fact, if you look at our experience, and once again, let me speak about my own experience, two cases, Greece and Ukraine. Everybody was predicting Greece to exit the euro. I remember 2012, 2013, all the analysts, and Greece is still with us. Everybody was saying it was impossible, as President Poroshenko just reminded us, to have a common position regarding Ukraine. And in fact, Europeans were able to take a common position concerning Ukraine. By the way, concerning Iran as well. So in fact, yes, we have extremely serious problems in Europe and challenges, and the issue of migration, illegal migration, is putting a lot of pressure because it's helping to fuel the populistic, xenophobic sentiments. But I really believe that the forces of integration are stronger than the force of disintegration, and for that we need a more committed leadership at national level.
Thank you. To Bernard-Henri Lévy. When I was a graduate student living in Europe, the idea of Europe was one that excited a lot of my fellow students. And when I look at Europe now, I see very little excitement about Europe in the collective sense. Plus, I see the impact of generational change, which was the impetus that led to the coal and steel community, what Mr. Schumann's vision. I don't even know what percentage of young people in Europe are aware of that. Essentially, is the idea that led to Europe now passé? Can it come back? Or essentially, are we now in some ways in a post-European time in history?
I do think that it can come back, of course, but I believe that the EU could fall apart. And if I resume the three words of our meeting of today, if I take them one by one, frankly, there are so many signs that the worst could happen. The migrants. The crisis of the migrants hits the European dream at the heart. One thing we should not forget is that Europe, originally, is the name of a migrant. Europe is the name of a princess coming from what is today Lebanon and taking and making the accurate, the precise journey which the migrants of today take. You cannot imagine Europe without migration. You cannot name Europe without alluding to this journey of the migrants. So there is something there which is hit very deeply in the European idea. The Brexit, everybody says that it is a very bad news for UK, and it is true. But I think that it might be an even worse news for Europe, for one reason. Of course, Mr. De Spaak, of course, Mr. Schuman, Mr. Jean Monnet, but one of the most important founding fathers of EU, of Europe, was an Englishman, Winston Churchill, whose speech of Zurich in 1947 or 48 really put the founding stones of the European idea. Not considering all the liberal current of thought in England, liberal in political terms, in economical terms, which are also at the bottom and at the head of the European idea. So, by the Brexit, it is another shoot at the heart or at the head. And the third word, populism. Europe was done, Europe was made in order to fight, as we all know, Nazism, never again, in order to fight colonialism, but also, and this is less well known, in order to fight populism. In all the philosophical tasks which preceded the birth of European Union, you had this idea of a reinvention of democracy which should turn back definitively, forever, or as much as possible, from populism. So we are facing today an attack on the roots of Europe, on the heart of Europe, and on the very spirit of Europe. That's why I think that, yes, it could fall apart.
Okay, so if we have on the table whether Europe will fall apart, could fall apart, is in some sort of existential crisis, I want to first turn to Karl Rove as give a transatlantic perspective. So here's the United States. For 2 generations, Europe has been its principal partner in the world, economically, strategically, and now suddenly the future of this principal partner is in some doubt. So how does all this look from the vantage point of where you sit as an American?
Thank you, Richard. I would suspect that for the average American, most of what happens in Europe is, as we've thought for decades, a matter of little concern. American policymakers are concerned with it, but the average American sort of assumes Europe will take care of itself. I was interested in the comment about these sentiments, these activities, these events in Europe having transatlantic consequences. And I think there's some truth in that, but I also think there's some significant differences between what is happening in Europe and what's happening in the United States that bear on our future relationship. Take the question of immigration. Our situation is much different than yours. Our situation is that we've seen this before. We've had 3 periods in American history where the share of our population has gotten to the point where 1 out of every 6 Americans is foreign-born. Happened in the 1880s and 1890s, happened in the 1930s, happening today. All 3 of them were also periods of populism. But that's entirely different than wave after wave after wave of Middle Eastern immigrants swarming across Europe. Ours is more easy to deal with. We've dealt with it 3 times before by turning down the dial on immigration a little bit, and the issue goes away. Similarly, populism. Our populism we've always been populistic. Heck, we began in an effort to elevate the ordinary citizen against the power of the king. So there's always been a little bit of populism in American politics, but generally channeled in a positive direction. And this current sort of burst of populism, I think, is to some degree potentially short-term in nature. We have people who looked at TARP, the bailout of the banks, necessary step in 2008, and then at the stimulus with the promises that were made, and then the Affordable Care Act, which was passed on a straight party line vote and remains unpopular today. And they looked at this and said, we've lost control of Washington. That, again, is entirely different than the situation that Europe faces. But I would say I'll end with where I began. I think, fortunately and unfortunately, most American politicians and most Americans pay little attention to the intricacies of the relationship with Europe or the events within Europe. They observe them, they watch them, but they are not deeply concerned with them. The advantage to you of that is that I think that American policymakers, by and large, have tended to take a great deal of interest in what happens in Europe, and so we've had a relative continuity, administration in and administration out. We'll see in January whether that continues, but America, for good or for ill, is an inward-looking country when it comes to what's going on in Europe.
Okay, what I'd like to do is open it up, have people ask questions. You want to ask them to everyone, or best yet, if you point them to one person on the panel, and I'll give everyone on the panel at the end a chance to give some final thoughts. Let me start with Charles Grant from the Center for European Reform.
I would like to reassure those who are worried that the experience of Brexit will encourage other countries to leave the EU. Let me make a prediction. When other countries see the effect of Brexit on the British economy in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, they won't contemplate it, because Britain is not going to be like Norway or Switzerland, plugged into the single market, closely integrated economically. It cannot go for those models, because the British will not pay money into the EU budget or accept free movement of labour. They will go for a Canadian-style free trade agreement between the EU and the UK, which will not give benefit to British services industries, not give British services industries or the City of London access to the European markets at all. So this is going to lead to a massive blockage of foreign investment in Britain. The British economy will grow much less fast than it would otherwise have grown. And when other countries see this happening, they will be deterred from similar ideas, in my view. They won't want to Brexit.
So Brexit may be the unintended, maybe an unintended boon for Europe. It'll actually become a new source of European cohesion and integration. Yet another irony. Someone over here, there was a gentleman who had his hand up in the, yes sir, in the third row right there with the yellow tie.
My name is Gerald Howarth. I'm the Member of Parliament for Aldershot in the United Kingdom, campaigned in 1975 and this year for Britain to leave the European Union. But I do want to start on a positive note to thank Victor Pinchuk for having brought us all here together and to concentrate our minds on a very serious issue for all of us in Europe, whether we are in the European Union or not, and that is the integrity of this country, Ukraine, and its freedom to decide who its friends are, who its allies are, and with whom it wishes to deal. And we should be standing foursquare behind Ukraine and resisting the aggression from Russia under President Putin. Can I say, Pat Cox, I do want to say you have picked up on, I think, the most important thing, which the others are ignoring, that this wave of objection to the European project in the United Kingdom is not restricted to the United Kingdom. What Mr. Barroso and others have simply dismissed as xenophobia and populism, this is the people. And it is not that the EPP and the Socialist Parties of Europe have lost the initiative. They've lost touch with the people. And unless you understand that the construct is a 1950s construct, the creation of the United States of Europe is being resisted not just in the United Kingdom, but in other parts of the EU, then I think that the project is going to continue to run into difficulty. And my compatriot who's just spoken has suggested in 4 or 5 years' time this gloomy prediction might come about. He's had to predict for 4 or 5 years ahead, because unfortunately for him, all the economic indicators so far have shown that the United Kingdom has had no ill effect economically from our Brexit. So can I put it to the panel, are you at all listening to the people? And are you not intent upon recognizing that there is something fundamentally flawed in the construct if so many people are objecting to it? And France and Germany in particular are going to face a very big challenge next year.
So why don't we make that a question for the panel, whether one's listening to the people or not, but what ought to be the collective response to the Brexit vote? What, if any, reforms, changes, you name it, whether in the narrow sense of dealing with Britain, but more broadly in terms of how Europe conducts its own business? What ought to be done as a result? Anyway,
sure. If you look at the Brexit, the main cause in all the assessments made so far was not so much against the bureaucracy in Brussels. Most people that have voted, they don't know how Brussels works. And there was a clear difference in terms of sociological levels of education between those who voted in favor and those who voted against. The real issue, and that's why it's so disturbing, even if there is a sophisticated cosmopolitan argument for Brexit that I can understand, was against foreigners. There is a concern in Britain that there are too many foreigners. And in fact, it is linked with enlargement. I spoke with David Cameron several times, and David Cameron, that was, by the way, Britain has been the great champion of enlargement of the European Union, but he said to me once, look, but now the enlargement is countries at different levels. And we cannot receive all those people from some of those new member states. So that is the reality. It is the feeling that we have too many foreigners. That feeling exists in Austria, where we had almost a post-Nazi gentleman winning the election, presidential election. We have these nationalistic feelings in other parts of Europe. So yes, it may be people that has this sentiment. It was people that had those xenophobic sentiments in Germany, in Austria, in the Second World War. But are we going to give up? That's the question. That's why I believe that the most democratic forces, the most progressive forces in this sense, should take the lead and try to make the case for Europe. Not an over-centralized Europe, not a Europe that destroys the national identity of our countries, that some of them, like mine, exist for almost 900 years. So we are not going to be the United States of Europe like we have the United States of America. I agree with that. But at the same time, a Europe that is, I think, the only way, the European Union, to defend the interests and the values of the citizens in face of the globalization. Because even the biggest country of Europe, like Germany, with 80 million, or countries like Britain with 60 million people, what can they do when they face a country like China with 1.5 billion? They cannot, they simply are not in the same league in terms of power. And it's about power we are speaking. But together, if we project our influence, if we pool our sovereignties, yes, together, the Europeans can, together with our American allies and friends, can defend the values, our values, the values of open societies, open economies, freedom, tolerance, and anti-xenophobic feelings. That's why I continue to believe we, the European Union, we have a future, but for that, there are risks. I completely agree also with Bernard-Henri Lévy. There are dangers that we should not underestimate, but we need leadership and we need to win that, the fight. Britain, by the way, was always also an exceptional case. It's true that Britain was the way it joined the European Union, and it's a country, in fact, because it's a very important country, that I believe where the appeal for exit is stronger than other countries. But it's true as well that we are listening to some of those arguments in other countries, for instance in France, like Madame Le Pen and others. But look at one thing. Almost all those who are against Europe are against foreigners, are against free trade, all of them, are against the transatlantic trade agreement with Americans, are against positive values of open societies. I'm not saying that everybody that voted in Britain are in that position. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that in Europe, the forces that are against Europe are some of the darkest forces that existed in our continent, like Mr. Wilders in the Netherlands, and that we should resist and win over those forces.
Everybody wants to join in, so Pat Cox, why don't you say something? We've got to get a few more comments, then we'll go to Mr. Bill.
I'm going to be brief. I want to pick up, because we have a few British threads in the conversation here. I think one of the issues that we need to avoid when we're analysing these challenges is to lapse into sweeping generalisation. So if I look, for example, at the disaggregated exit polls for the British referendum, which had a very high turnout and over 42 million people voted in this. When I look at the disaggregated polls, to make one point, it came in conversation earlier, if young Britain only was voting, an overwhelming majority would have voted for Europe to stay. And if I look at Eurobarometer polls since the British referendum, in most cases, public opinion has actually, in favour of Europe, with all of its diverse problems and challenges, has actually gone up, because people ask themselves the question, could this actually lead to disintegration, and is that really what I want? And they're indicating at least that there is out there, for political people in campaigning, a will on the part of others to stand back and reflect. And I think these things are important. The final comes more an historical point that was raised by Mr. Lévy in his comment. It is certainly true that in the post-war period, absent the challenge of being Prime Minister, since Clement Attlee won that job, Winston Churchill took to the stage and used the enormous prestige he had in the United States and in Europe. And he was the first to talk about the federal states idea for Europe. but I would underline that he was also one to say that this was not for the English-speaking peoples. And so he had the view, but he hadn't that view as a view for Britain. And I think there is a sense where Britain's engagement with Europe has always had to do with this integration process, a kind of semi-detachment, attached and detached, or semi-detached at the same time. And the final comment I've given that, simply locating this, when the Europeans had established the coal and steel community, and it was up and running, and they thought, what about adding an economic union? They met in Messina in Italy in 1955, and they thought it important to invite Britain, that wasn't in the coal and steel community, to come to Messina and to play a full part. Britain resiled, but had an observer, a Mr. Brereton from the Board of Trade. And he observed, but spoke near the end. I don't have the quote, but it's a wonderful quote, more or less saying, this stuff will never work. He said, bonne chance, Monsieur le Président, et au revoir. And some years later, the same United Kingdom, in straitened economic circumstances, knocked at that door. So the British case has British specificities, even as I observed earlier, that some of the issues are not uniquely British.
For the moment, the previsible consequences of Brexit are alas clear. On the side of the UK, the previsible consequence is a dislocation of UK. I don't know how the British will deal with the Scottish in the near future. I do not know how Ireland, the Northern Ireland with South Ireland, will work. It is in the peace agreement with Northern Ireland that there should not be visa, there should be free circulation between the two islands. I don't know how it will work in the time of Brexit, when the Brexit will be implemented. In the case of Europe, the consequence is also clear. What happened after Brexit? Scream of victory of Mr. Putin, congratulations by Mr. Trump, and rise of all the populist anti-European parties all over Europe. You have today some projects of Brexit in Poland, in Hungary, in Slovakia, and even in France. You have a project of Frexit, which is taken up by an important party in French politics, which is Front National. So, beyond economics, it is absolutely clear that Europe today is at the edge of a very black hole. What can be the solution? I'm sure there is a lot of financial and economic solutions, but there is one, which is in the hands of the leadership of Europe, which is a real step ahead in politics terms. There will not be a reply to Brexit if the peoples of Europe and their leaderships do not decide a real jump ahead in politics union. And I take one example of Ukraine. I was listening with so much emotion to President Poroshenko. Frankly, look at the situation. We have in Europe where everybody now is thinking to escape, to step out. Everybody, in a way or in another, is trying to imagine a world where he could step out. You have a country, Ukraine, which in this camp of ruins is asking to step in, is expressing its desire for Europe, its hope in Europe. This is what President Poroshenko told us this morning. This is what the people of Maidan said in 2014. And in front of this hope for Europe, in front of this demand of Europe, I'm sorry, Mr. Barroso, but how did Europe reply? And how does Europe still reply? Of course, sanctions. Of course, good gestures. But we reply as if the perspective of Ukraine being associated to Europe should be a burden. Not a hope, a burden. This is exactly the opposite of what we should do. If we want to reply to the Brexit, we have to say clearly that when a country a great country with a great history like Ukraine expresses the wish to join us, it is not a burden, but it is an addition of spirit. This will be the reply.
Okay, I'm going to get one more question, then I'll get Wolfgang there. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Anna Maria Corazza-Bildt, and I'm a member of the European Parliament for Sweden in the Joint Commission for Ukraine and Friends of Ukraine. I disagree with you. Why people from Turkey to Ukraine, from all of the neighboring countries, want to join the European Union? Why millions of people from the south risk their lives to come to Europe? There must be more than catastrophe in the European Union. And why we don't mobilize the young generations? Because we only talk about catastrophe. Because people like you go around saying that Europe is falling apart. How would our children be in love with Europe if the image we give is that's only catastrophe? Please answer to that question. Please tell me, what is the lesson of Brexit? Is that irresponsible, imploding political system with populists that only criticize, with lies after lies after lies for continued years, have not given a single alternative. That's why they haven't activated Article 50. They don't have a clue of what they wanted. The only thing they did is resign after bringing Britain, their children and our children into real catastrophe. Thank you so much for what you did for my kids. What is the alternative? What is the alternative to Brexit? Did you give an alternative of which relationship you want to the European Union? How you want to get out? Nothing. From June, we have not heard a word. Because there is no alternative that the distractors, the no-sayer, the populists, the Zarathustras, they always have. So if we would use some of our political authoritative energy of leadership in Europe to bring results, to solve the problems, to connect with the young generation, rather than criticizing and blaming seminar after seminar paid by the taxpayers of Europe, by the way, in Europe, not here, we would have better results. One, the trade agreement with the United States. That will bring jobs, growth. The trade agreement with Canada, now with this non-leadership decision to bring it back to the national parliaments, which is not what the treaty says, for lack of leadership. The service directive, why don't we open the service market? Jobs for the people of Europe, jobs for young people. This we should talk about, complete the single market. And yes, we have failed Ukraine. It's the member states, the lack of unity, I agree. But no one talks about that in Europe. In the destructive debate in Europe, no one said there is a war here. There's 1.5 million people that are displaced. There's a huge humanitarian catastrophe. And to our friends in the United States, Canada, and Australia, why is Syria a European problem? Why the resettlement program from the UNHCR is so underused? That is the highway to avoid people dying in the Mediterranean. Why aren't you taking more refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq? Stop blaming, accept refugees. Thank you.
Okay. What I'd like the panel to do is to respond. We got a chance for one last intervention from the floor. I'll start with Wolfgang. And in some ways, the common theme to this, it's not a narrow response to Brexit and how to negotiate Article 50. It's the broader response, which is what does Europe need to do in order to make the European idea appealing again, to avoid further disintegration. What essentially is what can and should Europe do? Because whatever its problems, one does not want to lose, if you will, the essence of the European project, because the forces that led to it are still relevant. So what is it what should be the agenda here? So Wolfgang, we'll start with you.
Right. All right. First, let me say I couldn't agree more with you, Anna Maria. I think that was a splendid intervention, not in the direction of pessimism and negativism, but in the direction of moving forward. Now, two remarks. First, let me remind the gentleman from London that it is almost exactly 70 years ago that Winston Churchill made that wonderful speech in Zurich, which offered us the vision. And I think we should not betray it, and we should certainly not abandon it. We, the continental Europeans. Second, in response to your question, what now needs to be done? We actually need to listen to the people, and we will. If you look at all the polls available, and I have tried very hard to look at all the polling data from the UK, from around the Union, what our people, our voters, wish the EU to do is to become, in the current international situation, a more effective provider of security, of a more effective provider of domestic security in terms of fighting crime and terrorism and et cetera, but also a more effective provider of external security. And that takes us directly again to the conflict here in Ukraine. Europe needs to stand up and defend our values, not only in terms of philosophical debate, but also in terms of hardcore military defense capabilities. That is what the voters are now wanting the European Union to do. And I think, let me just express my hope, Richard, that tonight or tomorrow morning, when the leaders finish their business in Bratislava, I hope that a message will come from Bratislava that the leaders set an agenda in terms of many different issues. It's not only about security, but I hope that they will respond positively to the need for Europe to provide our voters with a sense of security at home and abroad.
Okay, I'm getting that look. This has been an impassioned panel about Europe, which is actually something that's rare. It's refreshing in some ways to see the issues of Europe's future so intensely debated. One question was made about the United States. I just want to respond to quickly. I actually agree. In two areas, the United States has not lived up to what I believe are its international obligations in terms of what we've done or haven't done in Syria itself, and second of all, in terms of refugees. So I don't argue that point. That said, what I've got to do is thank the four gentlemen who are on this panel. It really was one of the most interesting conversations I've heard on this issue, this set of issues in quite a while. Could have gone on a lot longer, but alas, we can't. I ask you all to stay in your seats. What we're going to do is segue immediately to a session with the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey. So many of these same issues will continue to be heard from that perspective. So let me again thank you all, and please stay in your seats.
If we can get this microphone on. Ladies and gentlemen, do take Richard's advice, if you would. Stay in your seats if you possibly can, because I'm going to have my conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey in just a couple of minutes. So stretch your legs. We're going to move the furniture a little bit, and Mr. Şimşek will join me up here on the stage. So do stay with us. We will start in just a moment.